And now, continuing with our Mask of God series, I want to approach this video on three main topics pertaining to the chapter on the Animal Master and the three subchapters of that category, as well as the Paleolithic caves. He's going to have theories pertaining to really sexuality and different myths to come out of that, and how they relate to the Paleolithic culture and its relationship to things like the goddess figurines and things of that nature. And then concluding with going even further back to the Neanderthals and the bear cults, which seems to be really the oldest form of religiosity or ritualization, if you will, between the animal and the human. So, going to the Animal Master discussion, we look at this myth that Campbell presents to us of the Blackfoot Indians, and it's called the Legend of the Buffalo's Wife. And Campbell thinks that through this myth we can have really proclivities of understanding towards the Paleolithic and this sort of myths, because of course, as we've presented in other chapters, myths have this endurance really that can go through many epochs and ways of thinking and even people with very little changes to it. So he has a lot of confidence that we can look into the Paleolithic world, into how these myths are concreted out. And so the structure of what these myths could have been is really what he wants to emphasize. And one of those is the common practice of driving herds of animals off of cliffs to kill them off quickly. This is kind of how these hunter societies would go about, if they wanted to, kill off a lot of certain species. In this particular myth, though, there's a particular year or season where the buffaloes will no longer comply, and so they stop at the edge of the cliff. And down below there's a young starving girl who proclaims, she is saying this in a sort of jest-like way, that if the buffalo were to come down the cliff, she would marry them, again in like a sort of sarcastic way. However, this actually turns out to work, and so the buffalo just start to fall down the cliff. Before long, though, the Animal Master, this chapter revolves around, he represents really a sort of shaman, or really the ideal form of what that animal is said to be. And so the Animal Master comes and takes her away to marry her and take her up on that offer. And so, despite the fact that the tribe now is fed with this new herd of buffalo, they eventually, of course, come to realize that this girl was taken from them. And of course, the father then, he travels on a hunt to find them in the distance, and he sees eventually this Animal Master buffalo. So he's planning out how he could potentially hunt and kill this beast. But before he hatches his plan, a magpie comes and flies by him and requests the help from that magpie. So the magpie, of course, says yes, and so he goes and searches a sort of spy for the father hunter until he finds the daughter. So the magpie is saying, let's get out of here. Your father is looking for you. And in the meantime, the buffalo shaman, he breaks off one of his horns and asks for the girl to fill it with water. And so she takes the water to the well, and the father spots her off finally by herself and asks for her to come with her. And so she is reluctant and says that it's not that simple, and he needs to wait until the shaman is actually asleep. So she returns the water so the shaman takes a drink from it. But as he's taking a drink, he can actually smell the father. So he gets very angry with this, and so he finds the father, and the buffalo actually trample him into the earth. And so it's a sort of eye for an eye demonstration, really, of course, where these buffalo were herded off of the sides of cliffs. And so he, tells the girl, how does this feel to have your people now trampled to death? And so she cries out as her father is made one with the earth. And so the shaman buffalo then, he suggests a deal in a sort of merciful way that if she can actually bring him back to life, he'll let them both go. And so the girl then asks the magpie for a bone of her father. And so he brings back some, small spinal column piece of him. And so she starts to sing the song of resurrection under a blanket until he is actually fully resuscitated. And so the buffalo and the animal master is very impressed by this magic. And through this impression, he says he will teach her actually the song of resurrection. And this resurrection song is, again, a sort of deal, as we've talked about with this structure of the hunter myths, between the animal and the human, where through these rites, they're able to replenish them in exchange for the ritual. And so they agree to this, and so sets the relationship of all comrade societies amongst the Blackfoot Indians and their hierarchical approach really to the hunt. And so Campbell really believes that within this small myth here, we have clues to the Paleolithic world. And so he demonstrates actually about 7 of them through this myth here. And so the sculpture of Venus of Lascelles holding the buffalo horn, if you remember, is similar to that last myth that we discussed. Even though there is no dream time in hunter myth, everything's in the present. And the Aboriginals, for example, were hunters, even though, again, there is sometimes a multitude of different relations, really, and new assemblages that do happen between this binary here of hunters and planters. The Aboriginals here is an example of that, where there was influence of the planters, because we don't see this in the Blackfoot myths, or he thinks in the Paleolithic as well. And retaining to the shaman myth in the form of the magpie, they are communicators of the animal powers and acts as a sort of bridge to human communication. The other clue is the bone in comparison to the seed. In planters, of course, usually the beheading in the seed myths, where you have a plant that resuscitates the people after the sacrifice. Here we see it with a sort of bone as a sort of comparison or renewal or becoming of something growing or replenished after death. You can also see the bone stands for how the shaman has a sort of all-seeing, or at least a higher frequency compared to the typical vision of people, and we see that in shamanic art. And then he goes on to the animal master, which is something that Frobenius really pointed out in his travels, that the animal usually has a sort of shaman or animal master that can communicate with the humans, and they act as a sort of form. They're the essence, if you will, the platonic essence of that particular being, even though the phenomenal pieces within them are changing. So, it represents a sort of all-encompassing, always has been way this animal represents, even though there's, tons of changes, evolutionary conditions all the time happening to these animals. The 5th point being that the animal covenant, the buffalo, has agreed to resuscitate itself in an agreement with the humans in return for procreation. The 6th point being the moral difference between the slaying of animals the right way in ritualistic, a sort of rites, the song, the dance, the festivals, The hunt has a sort of sacredness about it, and we'll see in later examples, compared to the slaughterhouse, if you will, that we have in contemporary society that really sees it more as resources being extracted to feed global populations. The seventh point being the presence of a social hierarchy that patterns out to the hunters. We see this with totemism, where you have something akin to a minotaur hybrid being the descendant from, and cannot, where a hybrid, if you will, could not intermarry. So you have a sort of social hierarchy here. Now, the third part of this chapter or subsection is recounting of the ritual of returned blood, and accounts, again, Frobenius, of staying with the Congolese pygmies, who were also hunters displaced into the plateau region. And so Frobenius suggests that the tribe lost their nourishment to go hunt a different animal. He was traveling with them, and they were starving and really down bad. And so he suggested that we could just go hunt for a different animal than what they were looking for. And this was very strange to the hunters. And so the account goes something like, he's out with 3 men and a woman, and they're doing a sort of arrangement, because they don't just hunt for the sake of survival. There's a lot of processes and understandings and meanings going on through the act of the hunt. And so he's with 3 men and a woman, so they're tracing into the ground the antelope. And so they wait as the sun touches the image, and the hunter then shoots the image with an arrow as the woman raises her arms in a sort of worship, tracing all the way back to ancient Egypt. And they start doing a sort of magical chant, and then they go about and hunt the antelope, bring back later that day, and subsequently they would put blood on that very image they created and erase it, and returning the blood, returning the sacrifice back to the earth, has purposes of a magical returning. After the spilling of blood, there is a sort of revenge motif that Frobenius noticed that must be returned and then erased away. And so Campbell has an interesting insight into where he alludes to the sun as its imagery. The sun represents really the greatest hunter of all, because of course the sun is necessary for any sort of hunting to really take place. And there's also something to be said about being in tune with the lion figure symbolically, who appears on the plains and scares off the game, similar to how when the sun rises it scares off all of the night stars and constellations. And so there's a very interesting insights and account from Frobenius here with regards to the sacredness of the animal hunt itself. Now, moving on to chapter 8, which is a very interesting discussion on the Paleolithic caves, going to as far into the past as we can possibly really know. And so the first part of the chapter is Shamans of the Great Hunt, and the second subsection is a discussion of the Our Lady of the Mammoths. The third and final part being the cult of the master bear that originates with Neanderthal culture. So Campbell begins by speculating that the Paleolithic evidence here is really the first war of the sexes, or a sort of conflict really between the two male and female powers that they both possess, really. And so the Shamans of the Great Hunt, he examines the Cave of Lascelles as the final act of this era, and this originates back to 35,000 BC to about 12,000 BC, Lascelles being around modern France. And so we have a huge arc in this period of 25,000 years, in between glacier melting periods, and so there's a lot of stable ways of us being able to examine the differences here, because there is a huge arc here to consider. The Chauvet cave being the oldest at 35,000 BC, and with that you also have, of course, as mentioned, Lascelles, Tamira in the Magdalenian period from about 17,000 BC to 12,000 BC, and this is with the glaciers melting down. And so to end in between this is the Ignacian and the Solutrean, to then the Magdalenian, and then of course with Eastern Europe we have a whole separate culture going on. But beginning with Lascelles in focus, we have interesting imagery of these non-animal characters, and there's an image in the book here where there's two horns not associated with really any other animal in the kingdom. It's almost, I would say, it looks almost like a sort of demonic unicorn, as Campbell depicts. And then he wants to look at the shaft of the dead man scene. Now, he takes umbrage really with this interpretation of a hunting accident. Campbell thinks that this is wrong because, as we've mentioned in the discussion above of the ritual that Frobenius saw, nothing that is put into the magical conscious structure, the image of the antelope, if you will, is done with the idea of a sort of accident. Because if you depict an accident, then that is going to have ramifications for the concrete world at hand. It would be willed into the realm of phenomena. And so the ancients, or the primitives in this book that they're referred to, would have an understanding that by playing with these sort of images in the magic structure, you could cause events to happen in the real world. Now, a lot of people could scoff at that, but think about the way a lot of contemporary ways we go about medicine and healing, and the ideas of mindset and willing it into the world. A lot of inspiring people have always said something along the lines of, I always had this vision of how my success was going to be, how I was going to achieve something. And it doesn't seem as far-fetched when you consider that. And then there's the depiction, really, of the example of the bull with the hanging intestines by a spear through his body and exiting through his phallus, as well as a depiction of a shaman in a trance state with the bird's head. Of course, we've seen in a lot of these myths now, the shaman, evolves into a sort of bird-like figure, and it's a sort of common trope really with the shaman. He also accompanies with a staff with a bird on it, while a rhino wags his tail and there's just excrement flying everywhere. And so Campbell then brings in the work of Roheim and his evidence of the psychology of Australian Aboriginals. And so this goes into the idea of the pointing bone. Now, the pointing bone is a sort of secondary phallus, and it doesn't have a biological existence, if you will. It's a sort of secondary pointing of an imaginary bone between the scrotum and anus. If you know anything about skateboarding culture, we call that the gooch. So the shaman raises it up like a second phallus to curse where it points, and the shaman will use semen or excrement to put them in a trance or sleep. And they do this curse by penetrating right through between the scrotum and the anus, in that similar spot of where the secondary phallus is. And so this is the exact position where that bison we just discussed, and the staff in that position of the curse spot, also supplies images provided by Spencer and Golan of the Aboriginals wearing this pointy, secondary phallus-like headgear, similar to, again, the horn. And the rhino is familiar of the shaman in trance, and Campbell thinks it shows the power of the phallus capable of casting spells. Now, Campbell didn't have access to this information, but with the likes of Michael Rappingluke in his studies of archaeoastronomy, he saw the scene of the constellation of the Summer Triangle, where you could supplant this with the three stars of Deneb, Vega, and Altair. Deneb is in the position of Cygnus, and it's a swan in its constellation with the wings outspread. And the shaman is in the same spot with his bird head representing Deneb Vega is in Lyra, which is in the eye of the bull. And the eye of the bird on the staff represents Aquila, which is the eagle under the bird image, and thinks ultimately that this is representative of the Summer Triangle. But again, this was much later after Campbell had written this. Cultures of sculpture invented by the Paleolithic Germans, and so this is really the introduction to the Eastern Europe difference here, where you have in Hohenstein, Schnabel, with the earliest shamanic man and lion. And so at these sites, we have images of the mammoth and other ivory figurines, and they're beautifully crafted, and they're sort of like the size of a modern day action figure. They're just small ivory mammoth-like depictions. And then the earliest Paleolithic goddess figurine, Venus of Hol Fels, which is a pretty poorly or at least the craftsmanship is rather poor, but it goes all the way back to 37,000 BC. So the Venus figurines originated in about 30,000 BC from Austria, as well as the Venus of Galgenberg. All of these figurines come from the Eastern Europe region before it eventually trickles down south to the Pyrenees, with the Venus of Boudica at 26,000 BC in modern France. And so the Venus of La Selle seems to really be the finale, if you will, at 20,000 BC at La Selle, where you have the holding up of the buffalo horn and the moon at the same site. And this is a very old image of a human copulation, at least that we have, where she's riding a man who's underneath her. And so we have an interesting assemblage here of two different cultures intertwining until about 20,000 BC, where the female figurine in the Western Paleolithic just drops off of art completely. And meanwhile in the East, Russia, Ukraine, Siberia, by 16,000 BC, these figurines of the goddess are flourishing in the meantime. And so at some point, Campbell is trying to tell us here that the Western Paleolithic ejected and rejected on a metaphysical level the cult of the goddess. And so Campbell suggests actually that out of this act, this difference here, we could have seen the first example of iconoclasm, as many of the goddess images in Lascelles are defaced and stripped of their face. So this could be very well the first time we see a sort of defacement, or if you'd like, Baudrillard talks about, graffiti and a sort of affinity of defacement. Here, we see this thousands of years ago as perhaps maybe the earliest example of it. And so moving to the myth of the South American hunters at Terra del Fuego, there is a specific myth here of the women in this society having all of the power, and it goes along with the sun, Kron, and moon. They had a sort of conduit or a sort of human corporeal existence, and Kron, and whereas the moon goddess is Kra. And so there's a huge building, sacred house. It's a sort of large lodge in which all of the women lived and ruled over the men. And so the women had all of the access to metaphysics, the ideas of witchcraft and shamanism, the ability to will into society, or at least their society, what they wished. And the men, in the meantime, were just absolutely terrified and powerless of these women, because these women were able to create evil spirits. They wore these masks to scare these men with supernatural properties. And so one day, Kron is out hunting to catch a guanaco for the women. So the men are sort of servitude towards the hunt. And he notices that there are women resting at the lake, but they're actually rehearsing the very spiritual, supernatural deity acts that were being used to deceive the men. And so he goes to confront the women with the knowledge that they are false deities, and he plants a curse onto them and forces them to transform into water birds that disappear completely. And so he returns back to the lodge to rally the men with the knowledge that the spirits are actually fake. They're just simply putting on masks and sort of acting in a sort of heretical way of displaying deity properties. And so Kron tells the men, and the men aren't sure what to think about this, of course, because it's just a he say, she say sort of thing. But the women get hold of this, and so Kra, the goddess, says that we have to scare them with our greatest monster to date. But Kron instructs the men of the Sultan tribe, that's the tribe we're talking about here, to massacre all of the women except for the little girls who don't really have any say in the matter. And so the men then create their own lodge and dress up a man's society made to scare and intimidate the women to keep them from getting the upper hand again. And so Campbell points out other occurrences of this kind of myth with the pygmies of taking the power from women, and we also see this in the Aboriginals as well. Campbell then goes to quote Father Willem Schmidt's 12 volumes on the origin of the idea of God. And so we have the 3 stages of primitive culture in his scheme. And so the simplest hunting society acted very egalitarian. It was just between men and women equally going about hunt, fishing, and things of that nature. We think of the pygmies here as an example. And then the second phase gets going, and this is considered the big hunt. And so now the men have power over the hunting aspect, and so they gather in big groups, such as clans, or come about with a sort of organization to hunt things like mammoths. Of course, the mammoth hunter, you didn't just kill a mammoth by yourself. And that's the case in Eastern Europe. And with that, it's worth saying that you have initiations going on between the sexes now that are very strong in polarity. There is no more that is sort of egalitarian mindset now. The initiation rites for the woman is, of course, centered around the menstrual cycle, whereas the men would go through these brutal acts of things like circumcision, hanging them from the ceiling by their flesh, and making them bleed out until they lose consciousness. And so the big hunt required the power and organization of the huts and contained a sort of polarity with that. And then moving to the third phase, which is really based in the tropical planter culture shift to the womanly invention of horticulture and the process of finding nutrients, of gathering and figuring out the cycle of the seed to the harvested plant. And that contained a sort of power shift as well. And so the men then, feeling threatened, comes about to the fourth phase, which is a formation of the secret societies that we had mentioned earlier, in the overthrowing of the women power structure there. And in these hunter zones, it's much more rigorous to gain access. It's not just a puberty rite ritual that we talked about earlier, where it was open to all men who hit a certain age or threshold. This is where the societies were much more exclusive in their tribes, and did not contain the idea that any man who simply hit puberty could just gain access to them. And then Campbell returns to the Paleolithic discussion and suggests something like this explains the disappearance of the female figurines from Paleolithic art. And with that, shows the dimensions of the splitting, really, of this once fused group in Europe. They have about 7,000 years or so, but by the time you get to 20,000 BC, the attack on the images and perhaps even a great war between the Paleolithic could be based in a sort of battle of sexuality here. And as seen, the figurines all really disappear from 20,000 BC until 12,000 BC, where we see in modern Switzerland at the end of the Ice Age. But these figurines are much more in a sort of highly stylistic, geometrical form, and perhaps contain echoes to really the modern art, or at least how we see it. But there's a different sort of coding for the goddesses, such as in Eastern Europe, where you have the mammoth plump figures to its disappearance. And so Campbell suggests that, again, this looks like there was some sort of revolt about 20,000 years ago. And now moving to the second half of chapter 8, he's going to go back even further in time to the Middle Paleolithic, during the Eemian Glacier period, 100,000 years ago to about 115,000 years ago. Campbell begins this with the ritual of the Ainu of Japan, and so he's like kind of going around in this circumpolar cult of bear worship that he wants to emphasize on, that goes from Finland across to Siberia to the Northwest Pacific, India, and the Hudson Bay, where the bear now is this sort of primary animal. And so the Ainu ritual captures a live bear, puts it in a wooden cage. They raise this bear, this cub, if you will, and then eventually it is going to overcome the size of the cage. And at that point, when it's more likely to be dangerous and combative, they sacrifice it. And the reason being that the gods are so much in love with this world that they are materializing themselves as these bears, or a sort of incarnation through animals. And so the Ainu ritual is to free the god back into the higher plane. And so they release the bear, pin him down, shoot him in the heart with an arrow, strangle it, and lay it off to give offerings of his own flesh back to it. And so this perhaps is the oldest practice in worship of divinity in the animal. And it seems to go back to the bear, or the cave bear, of that last interglacial period. And so Campbell then looks at all of those different accounts of cave sites of bear skulls and thigh bones. And then this leads to the idea of the Neanderthal burials, where you see with them many times they would just have a sort of carving into the ground, a sort of cavern, if you will, perhaps something like a sort of vaginal opening, symbolically, or something of that nature, where they will throw down bones, and you'll never actually see in these sites, it appears, where there is sort of organs or something with that. It wasn't like they just caved in and collapsed on these people. One of the burials that we see at Kase Cave in Palestine, where there's 15 or 20 individuals And the famous Q9 site is of a woman lying on her side at her feet is an infant, but the grave is sprinkled with red ochre, which is found all the way across the ancient world. Red ochre seems to be related really to the menstrual blood. And now, in menstrual blood, at least for the ancients, it was theorized that when a woman was impregnated, she stopped, menstruation, because that blood is being used to build the new human life. And so that is an analogy perhaps to the reincarnation of a new individual to come back into the world. But the Neanderthals themselves didn't really use ochre for burials until they mixed with the Cro-Magnons. And with that, they sort of mingled their techniques. And so the next parallel is the Neanderthal burial at Kalabara, again in Palestine, where we find the most complete Neanderthal without its cranium. And the jaw is just really left behind. But the skull, if you will, usually was filled with jewels or different minerals and materials that were considered somewhat precious. And we also have evidence of cannibalism to get the flesh off of bones, and practice and reverence for the skull, in addition to the bear cave worship. And with that, the Neanderthals themselves disappear by 27,000 BC because the Cro-Magnon is introduced, and the Neanderthals, they were much more burly and less intelligent, really. The Cro-Magnon is much more lighter, intelligent. The typical Neanderthal site that we've excavated contains about 15 or so types of tools for these practices, where the Cro-Magnon contained maybe 50 or more of them. And so they definitely innovated with the new way of making a fire, with the use of something like a draft to bring in everything about, and they just had a sort of complexity of thought that was much superior to the Neanderthal, with sophisticated tools and much more thought out and abstract processes to things like hunting or burials, whatever the case may be. And so essentially this chapter revolves around the worship of the bear as the earliest and most revered animal. And so Campbell accounts of the hunter and the equatorial zone from West Africa through Sudan to the tip of India to Polynesia and Brazil. And so we have that, again, recapping the myth of the killed sacrifice and incarnation of the primordial god. And out of the burial of that, we have the head plant that erupts with nourishment, sustaining of life. Whereas in his examples, and he's gone on through this whole book now talking about it, the north world of hunters, although we have seen some in the south with the likes of Del Fuego, we have the worship of the animal master and the shamanic dimensions between humans and animals, that bridge that seems invisible only to the animal master and the shamans with that. So I think that's going to really end the discussion on these two chapters before moving on to the final part of the book. If you like this video and like this series, consider liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing it around. Thanks for watching.